Okay, I think we'll get started. So welcome everyone from the icy depths of Southeast London, and thank you for coming today to what may well be your first webinar of 2024. And if it's not, then you're perhaps going to too many webinars. I'm Will Snell, I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairness Foundation, and I'm pleased to be chairing this event in partnership with the Policy Institute at King's College London as part of our Fair Society event series. Previous events in the series have featured leading thinkers, including former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, the authors of The Spirit Level, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, the health inequalities expert, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, and the Harvard philosopher, Michael Sandel. Delighted to be here today and to welcome Peter Turchin to talk about his fascinating book, End Times, Counter-Elites and the Path of Political Disintegration. And we'll be talking about what factors drive political turmoil and societal breakdown, and how elites sustain their dominance, and why ruling classes occasionally lose their hold on power. Are we truly living in end times, or can history provide a glimmer of optimism for breaking free from past cycles? And after about 15 minutes of hearing from Peter, we will have responses from our brilliant panel. Firstly, Gerry Mitchell, who is a social policy researcher, community activist, writer, and co-author of Uncomfortably Off, Why the Top 10% of Earners Should Care About Inequality, followed by Paul Somerville, adjunct professor at the Gustafsson School of Business at the University of Victoria, and the co-author of Reclaiming Populism, How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters, and last but not least, Mary Harrington, contributing editor at UnHerd and author of Feminism Against Progress. After that, we should have plenty of time for questions before we finish at 2 p.m. sharp. So please do submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. The earlier the better, and you can also upvote other people's questions. I'm going to stop now and pass straight over to Peter. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Will. All right, let me start with the first question. What are end times? Complex human societies organized as states have been around for about 5,000 years, and for a while they can experience periods of high internal peace and order, perhaps a century long, sometimes more, sometimes less. But inevitably, until at least in the past, they eventually enter periods of high social unrest and political disintegration. And this is what I have called end times. So think about the end of the Ancien regime in France, which was French Revolution, and following events, Russian revolutions, American civil wars. So this is a very frequent and in fact, in some sense, regular occurrence. Why? So my research team has been analyzing hundreds of cases of past societies entering into crisis over the last few thousand years. And the common theme we find is that during the pre-crisis times, these societies develop the condition that we call elite overproduction. Simply put, it's too many wannabe elites vying for a fixed number of power positions. It's sort of like a game of musical chairs, except instead of removing chairs as the game advances, we keep the number of chairs the same, but increase the number of players. And so as the number of players increases from the initial 11, let's say per 10 chairs to 20, 30, even 40, you can imagine how much chaos would ensue. What happens is that as the number of elite aspirants, right, people who aim for power positions in a state or a society, as the number of elite aspirants increases, inevitably the number of losers also increases, and many of them turn into angry losers and start making troubles. So that's really one of the most important processes that drives what we often observe, and now we observe in the United States, for example, less vividly in Europe, but we can talk about that later. So what we see is divided elites, dysfunctional governance, the rise of anti-systemic politicians like Donald Trump is probably the best example. So this is how we end up in end times. All right, but let's step back. Let's talk about elite overproduction. And the very first question I want to address is, who are the elites? I use a neutral sociological definition. Elites are neither good people nor bad people, neither smart nor dumb people. Simply put, they are the small proportion of population that concentrates social power in their hands. Right. So examples include the proverbial 1% in America, although it's not strictly 1%. We can talk about that later. More historical examples are the Mandarin class in Imperial China, or going even back in time, military nobility in medieval France. Generally speaking, power is defined, social power is defined as the ability to influence other people's behavior. And sociologists think of social power as coming in four basic flavors. It's military, when you force people to do something; economic power, when you pay people to do something; political administrative power, when by virtue of your position in an organization, you can actually tell people what to do; and the softest but extremely important fourth source of power is ideological or persuasion. Right. So key question now, in order for us to understand elite overproduction, is how are elites reproduced and recruited? All right. So there are always more elite aspirants than their power positions, and some competition is good. The problem is that excessive competition is destructive. It undermines social cooperation, and it also creates a large swaths of angry losers who tend to become, to start playing against the ruling regime. And we call them counter-elites. So those counter-elites, think about Lenin, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, Castro, Los Barbudos, and many other examples. They are the ones who work to overturn the reigning order and install themselves as the governing elites. All right, so this is what elite overproduction is. It's a common theme on the road to crisis. In fact, all serious periods of social disintegration and political fragmentation that we have in the database, they are preceded by elite overproduction, which leads to increased intra-elite competition, conflict, and then a breaking down of public order. So one of the most important segments of the elites are people with advanced degrees, especially in the United States and, let's say, UK. These are people who have law degrees. It's actually quite a general pattern, because if you think about famous revolutionaries, just think about Robespierre, Lenin and Castro, whom I mentioned, but also Gandhi, Lincoln. They were all trained as lawyers, all right? So in the United States, for example, there are two pipelines into the elites, and getting law degree is one of these important pipelines. The second pipeline is wealth. All right, but let's step back. Why do societies periodically get into these elite overproduction situations that lead eventually to outbreak of political violence? What is the root cause that drives that? And here we come to another important concept that I discuss in my book. I call it the wealth pump. The wealth pump sounds nice, but actually I'm talking about a perverse wealth pump that takes wealth from the poor and gives it to the rich. So why does the wealth pump develop? It works in different ways in different types of societies. So, for example, in medieval societies, this would often take the form of coercion, where landlords would force peasants to yield more produce from their land to the overlords. In more modern societies, this takes the form of stagnating wages that increase the profits of business owners and managers. But generically, in all societies, no complex societies, the general mechanism that leads to the wealth pump starting to operate is this. So, as I said, historically, societies typically experience long periods of internal peace and order. So during this period, the elites are becoming tempted to reconfigure the economy in their favor. And they do it in a variety of ways, but essentially they configure economy in such a way that they are starting to get more and more and unfair share of the economic pie. In the traditional societies where we did not have the economic growth, we would see absolute immiseration of peasants, for example. In more modern societies, what happens is that the fruits of economic growth become unequally divided. Less and less of that goes to the working classes, and more goes to the elites. And that's what I call the wealth pump. Right, now, why is wealth pump bad? Well, first of all, and most obviously, it creates immiseration. It results in stagnating and even declining living standards of the population. And I'm not only talking about economic part here. We are thinking about well-being in more holistic terms. So, for example, let's take an example of the United States, which of course I have studied back and forth. Let's say that during the late 1970s, many of you have seen this graph where the productivity of American workers continues to increase, but during the late 1970s, the wages, the real wages that had increased together with their productivity until 1970s, suddenly start stagnating and even declining. All right, so this is wealth pump. All that extra productivity did not go to the workers. It went elsewhere. It went to the economic elites. All right, so back to the more holistic understanding of well-being. So what we see is not only real wages stagnated, and with some segments of population declined, especially for less educated. But also we see other indicators of well-being, biological well-being. So, for example, life expectancies in the United States started to decline even before COVID. And now, of course, with added COVID shock, we have lost more than 20 years of progress in life expectancy. And the United States is lagging badly behind other OECD countries. And there are other things. There's social social aspects. There the perceived happiness indices are all going down, and we see the rise of deaths of despair that I'm sure you're familiar with. So the increased probability of suicide, drug abuse, and so on and so forth. Right. So let me just say that the first and obvious result from the wealth pump operating over long times, I mean, it's been operating now over 40 years, is the declining well-being of most of the population, of the proverbial 99%. But that's only the most obvious one. There are two other ones, which are less obvious, but they are also factors that undermine the stability of societies. So obviously, discontent of the large segments of the population undermines the stability. But also, this wealth has to go somewhere, and it goes to create a bloated class of wealth holders. In the United States, over the past 40 years, the number of uber wealthy, let's say $10 million or more in wealth, has increased by a factor of 10-fold, right? The population grew by 40%, but the number of decamillionaires increased 10-fold. And same thing happens at the level of 100 millions and the billionaires and so on and so forth. Now, you would think, okay, what's wrong with that? I mean, isn't that part of the American dream? But the problem is that many of the wealthy actually often turn their interests to political arena. Of course, Donald Trump is the most striking example of that. But in the United States, we've seen other billionaires like Michael Bloomberg, for example, Steve Forbes, although Steve Forbes was not particularly successful. So a certain proportion, maybe not so large, of the wealth holders wants to play in the political arena. All right, if you increase the numbers tenfold, you increase the numbers of political aspirants arising through this route tenfold. All right, but we still have one president, 100 senators, and so on and so forth. The number of positions in politics is fixed, and therefore, by increasing the number of elite aspirants, we are turning on the problem of elite overproduction, and that leads to the creation of large swaths of counter elites. So these are these counter elites often become political entrepreneurs who channel the already existing popular discontent. And that's why we see a lot of populist movements arising recently, both in the United States and in Europe. But this is a very old problem. Many people don't realize that there was a populist party in the Republican Rome. So Brother Gracchi were the leaders of it in the late 2nd century, and during the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar was one of the main leaders of this populares. So this is the second route. And the third one is that increasing immiseration creates a strong push factor for more active, intelligent, hardworking people from the commoner class to escape precarity, all right, and try to enter the elites. And that's why we see an increased, and not just today, but back in the 19th century and before that in the 17th century and so on. Every time this wealth pump was operating for a while, we see an increased demand for education. And it is not education as we typically understand that. It's not to educate oneself, it's rather to get the credentials that would allow one to compete in the labor market and also to enter the ranks of the elites. So, for example, the overproduction of lawyers, we overproduce lawyers in the United States by a factor of 3, right? So, and then now with ChatGPT, it's likely that the number of positions will be halved. So you have 6 times as many lawyers as positions, and that is a very dangerous situation. All right, let me wrap up because I'm almost out of my time. I'll just say that where does all these insights come from? They come from the new science of history, which we call Cliodynamics. Clio is the Greek muse of history. And all these human social systems are complex systems. We have to study them using the tools of complexity science. We have to translate our ideas about how societies work into models, computational models. And most importantly, we need to test different hypotheses, different theories against each other using data. And that is what Cliodynamics does. And that's where all these insights that I've been trying to, very briefly describe to you. And of course, the book gives much more detail. This is where it comes from. And the final thing I want to say that our science is very new. it's still, it's not as developed as physics, or whatever. And therefore, take everything that I've said with a grain of salt. We still need a lot more work to understand why we get into this end times, and most importantly, how do we get out of them? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. And lots to dig into there in the Q&A, including around your thoughts on where we are in the UK in relation to some of the dynamics you've described. I'm going to hand over to Gerry now to share her perspectives from her own research.
Thanks, Will. And please keep me to time if I overrun, maybe give me last 30 seconds or something. So the big items that define the quality of life for the American middle class, as described by Peter in End Times, are the same for high earners, the top 10% that Marcus and I interviewed for our research in the UK in 2019. So Peter cites higher education, owning a home, keeping yourself healthy. And as we all know, the cost of all three in the US and in the UK has increased much more than official inflation. Nevertheless, our respondents had degrees, were largely mortgage holders, and were in good health. So to what extent do they articulate the structural factors of instability laid out in End Times? So taking each in turn, popular immiseration. Our respondents were not aware of the extent or depth of it in the UK, having little contact with lower socioeconomic groups. They had really no idea of where they sit on the income distribution. They considered themselves normal, and were also at the same time looking upward at those sitting higher up on the income distribution. And so they also didn't feel rich. Even back in 2016, according to EU Silk survey data, which we draw in the book, 12% of them were declaring, 12% of the top 10% were declaring that they found it hard to reach the end of the month. In other words, high earners have been aware for a while that their lifestyle is becoming harder to sustain and socially reproduce. So what of failing fiscal health, the weakened legitimacy of the state, and geopolitical factors outlined in Peter's book? Well, they do fear a weakened legitimacy of the state. They don't speak of it in those terms, of course, and they don't see any need for democratic reform. But they are concerned about the decline of social and psychological well-being that Peter's just talked about, the breakdown of social connectedness that Peter talks about in the book. They're concerned about political instability and divisive populist politics. They're often nostalgic for the centre ground. However, as Peter has said recently, I watched your interview in Navarre, which I really enjoyed, this is an elite centre. And as Martin Gillen's found, and Peter cites, between 1981 and 2003, in the US, the preferences of both the average and the low-income voters had no effect on legislative changes. Only elite preferences and needs were met. So while Peter mentions that Gillen's probably meant the top 1%, but couldn't refine the data, our research focused on those lower down the decile, just underneath them. And despite being not in the top 1% largely, they do take that policy preference link for granted, but are aware that centrist politics are becoming increasingly unpopular with large parts of the electorate. In terms of elite overproduction, they were starting to feel the link between meritocratic reward for hard work, as they kept repeating, and social status. They did voice concerns about their work paying less and less, middle-class jobs hollowing out, returns on degrees being ever lower, education more expensive, and that owning your own home is near impossible for their children. So they do fear downward mobility, both for themselves and their children. They are more aware, particularly since the pandemic, that catastrophic events could derail their upward trajectories. They sense that conditions are lining up for further instability, and they sense that those factors behind their anxieties are wider than themselves, but they don't question why. Their perceptions of crises, the strategies they use preparing and coping with them, and this is one of the central arguments of our book, Uncomfortably Off, those strategies they're using reinforce the distance between themselves and the rest of society, and therefore become barriers to the likelihood of progressive future policy responses. They certainly don't connect the possibility of common prosperity with the need to regulate excessive wealth inequality. They instead account for our failing fiscal health by repeating the need to tighten the purse strings. They think we spend more than other countries, and not one person interviewed referred to the under-resourcing of the NHS, but many did talk about mismanagement and so-called inefficiency. So the individualizing meritocratic views they hold mean that they feel they'll never be personally affected by crises. They can always move. They can continue to insulate and isolate themselves, relocating perhaps for work. And they continue to enable the 1% that Peter's talked about by continuing to service, protect, legitimize, and grow their wealth. And I would include academics in that, to legitimizing in some extent. The high earners we interviewed also have a mistaken view of their relationship to the state in the UK. They think they don't need it, when in fact, looking at public health services, as Michael Marmot has documented, the top 10% live the longest and are least likely to die a quick death at a younger age. They will stagger on, as Danny Dorling said, with the most comorbidities, and therefore they need public health services the most. And crucially, as other speakers on this series have said, Wilkinson and Pickett, on a whole range of indicators, we are all affected, including high earners, by not how healthy a country is, but how equal it is. And Marmot's work showed the spillover effects of health inequality, even on high earners, 8 years less life, I think he said. So the top 1% don't need public services and infrastructure, but the people we interviewed, the 10% certainly do. They gain from them directly and indirectly. So high earners sense their material interests are changing, especially if they can't rely on assets. The strategies they have used to propel them upwards will prove increasingly difficult and less effective. Perhaps the best hope is that the children of the people we interviewed, despite not constituting what Peter refers to as a youth bulge, are nevertheless more affected by the diminishing returns of meritocracy and increased production, and may be forced or even decide to question and then reject the hamster wheel existence, choosing a new form of mobility. Maybe we will come up with a Chinese version of lying flat or letting it rot, as the Wall Street Journal was writing about the other day. The young people in China who've quitted the upwardly mobile trajectory their parents set them on or hoped that they would set on, and are choosing something, an alternative. So our interest in writing Uncomfortably Off was to start building common understanding about the consequences of extreme inequality, and from that foundation, encourage deliberation about what a future UK could look like if it weren't so unequal. And this is really why I support the work of the Fairness Foundation, because that's exactly what it's trying to do. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gerry. I'll hand over to Paul.
I'd like to thank Will for today's invitation and Adrian Pabst for introducing us. I certainly enjoy history that analyzes cycles, something that most historians do. However, I do not agree with Peter's assertion that instability is inherent in all societies because of the iron law of oligarchy. Peter's argument that the oligarchy turn on the wealth pump, so the same process is repeated in all historical states, explaining why instability waves always recur, is in my view both analytically flawed and unnecessarily pessimistic. We are not doomed to endless cycles ending in bust, providing we understand and act on what is really at risk. To begin, Peter overemphasizes the singular importance of income and wealth inequality on social mobility, and thus misses the true cause of the populist complaint and the resulting social disruption. Peter focuses on the rise of American income and wealth inequality since 1970, using his metaphor of the wealth pump that takes from the poor and gives to the rich. However, wealth and income inequality do not have much to do with the rise of populism, as was demonstrated in my co-authored book, Reclaiming Populism. Studies have identified other factors that impact social mobility, including commuting time, racial segregation, single parenthood, access to quality health and healthcare and education. There is compelling evidence that people don't object to seeing others get rich, provided it is done fairly, like inventing a new technology or even bending the ball like Beckham. The problem to focus on is not that outcomes are unequal. Instead, the question is whether opportunity is fair and outcomes are fairly achieved. Next, what is driving the cycles that Peter describes if we are to manage the consequences of the change they represent? Most cycles come from technological disruption and structural economic change that are always at work in our communities, the speed of which today is only accelerating. Societal equilibrium is a moving target due to the enormous impact that fast-changing new technologies have on the structure of the economy and the winners and losers that this transition inevitably creates. Armed with this understanding, we don't have to throw our hands up in the air and bemoan the inevitable societal collapse. The challenge is whether the political system is capable of narrowing these differences and putting in place the architecture for the next cycle of change based on economic fairness. Public policy would require that personal characteristics will not determine a person's life chances. Mandate that the rules of competition apply equally, embracing income and wealth inequality, and provide substantive support by giving all citizens the tools they need to become and remain productive. It is very important to stress that fair but unequal outcomes are essential to successful democracies because they reward study, innovation, hard work, discipline, luck, and natural talent. Finally, Peter posits that the solution to disruption is for a disenfranchised subset of enlightened elites to take back control and rebalance society. I think this prescription defies history. Change has always required action from below, ordinary citizens, voting, organizing, striking, fighting, even refusing to move to the back of a bus for the chance at a fairer life, the 8-hour workday, the end to child labor, work safety, and so on. Any hope we have for positive change starts with the everyday citizen, the canary in the coal mine. So the answer is yes to today's question. Can history provide a glimmer of optimism for breaking free from past cycles? Because history gives us a pathway against disruption, fairness. However, beware the warning from history that when we forget fairness, dangerous myths, ancient hatreds, and malignant prejudices, ethnic nationalism, anti-Semitism, the demonizing of internal and external minorities, ooze out from the shadows and whispers to the center of our cultural and political lives, sermonized by narcissistic charlatans. Economic fairness is one of the great protectors of the individual against the violence of the crowd, as well as potential cycles of disruptions ignited by technological advance and structural economic change. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. What a privilege to be able to speak last and hear everybody else's brilliant contributions first. So I wanted to speak to one of the questions which is sat in our Q&A from one David Wood, who asks about whether there are any examples from history of periods where a polity has managed to avert or at least partially swerve some of these symptoms that Peter so ably describes in his book, End Times. And one of the sections in Peter's book, which I found most compelling and actually which speaks to this question, is the 19th century in Britain, where if I understand you correctly, Peter, you describe how, by contrast with several European nations, a number of which experienced revolution around midway through the 19th century, due to varying by geography, but often very similar sets of economic and sociocultural changes. Britain managed to avert any full-scale revolution, although we came pretty close through a series of legislative and public reforms, which come first by adjusting our trade legislation, repealing the Corn Laws, which brought down the price of bread for working people, and finally culminating in the 1867 Reform Act, which extended the franchise and made a number of other important political reforms, which, to the best of my understanding, Peter argues, and I agree with him, rebalanced the polity between the interests of the old agrarian landowners, the new industrial mercantile class, and the urban working poor, who had grown substantially as part of the body politic and who demanded a voice which they at the time did not have. And because this came about incrementally through something like the democratic process with a fairly minimal amount of rioting relative to Europe. This is actually a good example of how we can more or less swerve these kinds of changes. And really what I find fascinating about the 1867 Reform Act is that it's the beginning of the modern labour movement. really, the beginning, but the point where the modern labour movement gained teeth, because that was the point at which working men began being elected to Parliament. Immediately downstream of the Reform Act, where it was the working class began to have a voice actually within the halls of power, which had just not previously been the case. And if I remember right, I mean, my history of the Labour Party is slightly sketchy, but to the best of my recollection, the German Labour Party came into being not very long after the Reform Act. Or maybe it was the early 20th century. Anyway, it was downstream of the Reform Act. But what I find interesting and both instructive but also troubling in the context of where we are now is that these political changes which came about were all fundamentally predicated, as was much of the labour movement and industrial reform and all the social goods which have flowed for the general population since then out of the labour movement and the political activity of the Labour Party, were directly consequential on the fact that the industrial proletariat was needed. The country as a whole didn't function without people, men and women, who worked in the factories. And so one of the head scratchers which I find myself, turning over not very happily today is what does that look like for the masses in Britain or in another post-industrial country now that we've deindustrialized? What does that mean for the power of the common man and woman? That now that we've deindustrialized, where does the power of the masses exist anymore, such that we are even capable of holding the feet of power to the fire? And I don't have an answer to that, and I'm not sure that anybody does. And my sense is that the various inchoate people, it's commonly known as populist movements, the Gilets jaunes and the equivalent movements that often with strange, sometimes quite conspiratorial or incoherent political programs. My sense of interacting with these groups is that most of them are conscious at some level or another of this profound disempowerment they have relative to the 20th century labour movements, and are deeply concerned about what their collective future looks like in its context. So if the working classes are straightforwardly no longer needed, and if futurists such as Yuval Noah Harari are right, and that we're on track, for especially via automation, AI, the globalization of finance, the globalization of trade, etc., and so on, for a world in which the vast majority of the masses are, as Harari puts it, effectively useless eaters, then what is the equivalent mechanism whereby anybody is able to hold the elite's feet to the fire? I find this a deeply concerning question. And I think in that context, I suppose one question we might ask of any putative counter elite, which I think is a fair challenge, which is levelled today at would-be counter elites coming from both the extreme left and the extreme right, is that they simply have no interest in or no comprehension of the material interests or concerns of ordinary working people, that they're as dematerialized and as esoteric in their way as the elites which they set out to challenge. And the difficulty for me is how are we going to rebrand this if Harari is right, to put it bluntly? I don't know the answer to that. And although I share the concerns of everybody on this panel about the need to return to a greater understanding of fairness, and I agree with, Paul speaks to the question, how do we adjust the broader political landscape in order to take these changes into account? I think you're right to ask that question, but I suppose the question which either an elite or a counter elite might retort to you, Paul, is why would we bother? Who cares? Who cares what the plebs think? They can't do anything. What leverage do they have? And I suppose that's the question which Peter's book left me with, and it's not very gloomy future prognosis for mass democracy that Peter's book left me with. I know this is a prognosis that Peter himself doesn't share. He's considerably more optimistic about our existing political arrangements. But it left me with some questions about the prognosis for our political settlement at a very profound level. And I think if anything is likely to shake that radically out of its current apparent stalemate, it will be, as Gerry put it, almost certainly the children of the children of the current 10%, and who every time I come across them appear to be radical at a level which is genuinely shocking to people of my age. Whether they're approaching it from the left or from the right, they're willing to contemplate political possibilities which would be simply unthinkable for a late Gen Xer such as I am. I think we're in, as Peter says, for some pretty rough times, and I think the contours of those rough times may be considerably broader and more chaotic than perhaps any of us would like. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Mary. Peter, I'd like to come back to you, if I may, and ask for your reactions to some of the reflections from our panelists. So, to Gerry's point about the reaction of people in the top 10% in the UK, and this idea that people are sort of tightening their own purse strings rather than necessarily looking for broader change. And obviously to Mary's point about their children, to Paul's point about the real problem being a lack of fairness rather than inequality and a wealth pump, and then to Mary's point around the extent to which we can no longer rely on the need of society and the economy for an industrial proletariat, and I suppose linked to that, your thoughts on the extent to which we are reliant on an enlightened section of the elite recognizing and acting on the need for change as opposed to external pressure, and where do you think the UK sits at the moment in relation to your analysis of the US situation? Sorry, that's an awful lot of questions, but hopefully a set of things to get your teeth into.
Oh, okay. Let me try and be concise in dealing with this. Is a huge, task you asked for me. Well, first of all, let me just talk about inequality in a bit. In fact, inequality is not a major driver in the theory that I advocate, because for things that Gerry said. In fact, there is a number of research articles that show that people, non-economists especially, have no idea about not only their position in the wealth or income distribution, but even what is that income and wealth distribution. So, and of course, in order for a driver to be in order for us to treat it as a real process, we have to understand how it works down all the way to the level of individuals. And so I rely on the work of such economists as Richard Easterlin and many others who point to the importance of the relative immiseration. Essentially, what makes sense to me is that people who grow up in the households of their parents, they have, that's the level of economic well-being that is the relevant, comparison for them. And so if they fall below that, right, that's when they become unhappy. This was greatly expressed by a Greek student in one of the Athenian demonstrations. He yelled, "It is not right that children should live worse than their parents." Right, so so when people feel this is, I try to unpack this in my book using a semi-fictional character to see how it really works. What does immiseration mean really at the level of people? So that's one point. So fairness, I actually don't disagree with Paul. Many things that Paul said, I, in fact, agree with. I don't say that we are doomed to these cycles. That's what the last chapter of my book actually describes. And thank you very much, Mary, for bringing up the examples where societies have avoided revolutions of civil wars. In fact, I talk about 4 different examples, including the Chartist period in UK. And so I hope that we will learn to do that. And in fact, our analysis of data shows that over the past several thousand years, our societies are evolving to become more resilient to these forces. And that's what also gives me hope that we will eventually be able to turn off this cycle. Right, now back to the 10%. So the way what we see here, I won't be able to completely address this issue, but let me offer some thoughts. So why are 10% feeling so unhappy? The problem is that when this is what we see over and over again in past societies, when elite overproduction begins to be a serious problem, it essentially there is a fight from all the way down the pyramid, right? There is a fight for the, let's say, the top positions in the elites, the wealthiest segment, right? They are competing among themselves, and they start using a variety of means to get ahead of the Joneses by what's known as conspicuous consumption, right? And that all percolates down the social ladder. So the 1%ers are actually trying to get into 1% of 1%, 10%ers are trying to get into 1%, and of course the 90% are trying to get into 10%. So when society is unbalanced, we see this the secondary product flows down all the way from the top, essentially. All right. So that's let me just what we see as what Mary especially mentioned, the high degree of polarization, both right and left, and also amongst the left and right. This is the ideological landscape is completely fragmented. The Stalinists hate Maoists more, or anarchists more than they hate the right-wingers, and so on and so forth. Maybe within right wing, there's the same thing. So this, I take it just to wrap it up. What we see amongst 10% actually, I think, reflects also what happens higher up, but it's harder to get data on those, on 1%, and especially 1% of 1%. All right, but my feeling is that it's actually characterizes the state of our society, and this is very typical. We see the same thing in historical periods. In historical periods, they would be duels, right, and assassinations. All right, we have not got that far, so hopefully we are becoming more civilized. But so now it's character assassination and things like that. So let me probably stop here so I don't take up too much time.
Thank you, Peter. Could you briefly talk to this point around your perception of whether you characterize the UK at this present time and where you see things playing out in the UK over the next few years, without wishing you to peer into the future too much, as compared to the US, for example?
Yeah, in order to answer your question, we need to do quite a lot of empirical work because we need to look at dozens of indicators. Fortunately, some colleagues of mine have done that. And essentially what it looks like that UK is slightly behind the United States. It's essentially, it's very close. And the pitch of both immiseration and inter-elite conflict, it has reached very similar levels as to what the United States is doing. And it is different from continental Europe, where Germany is probably like 20 years behind the US, and some other countries are only now recently started moving in this direction. Again, to me, inequality is not the driver, but it's a good proxy. And so by looking how wealth and income inequality, when it started to increase, all right, that gives us some idea about how advanced the operation of the wealth pump has been. And wealth pump has to operate for a long time to create these pressures that eventually tear societies apart. But just to say that UK, I mean, just listening to Gerry and Mary, UK is very close to the boiling point. It's quite obvious to people who are observing the society from the inside.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to go around the panel now in reverse order, I think. So Mary, Paul, Gerry, and then Peter. Well, let's do 2 questions. I'm just trying to deal with some of the questions from the audience as well. Let's do 2 questions, one at a time. So the first question is, I've now lost it. What do you think that government should be doing to tackle these issues over the next few years? And feel free to answer with respect to the UK in particular or more generally. And then I'll come back again with a second question at the end. Mary, do you want to start? You're on mute, Mary.
Here I am. I'm unmuted. There are two angles that I come at this from at the macro policy level. I would love to see. I mean, one of the greatest sources of anger, and I suspect one of the greatest, one of the slipperiest conduits for the wealth pump, is the financialization of the polity. You know, the selling overseas of assets, the hollowing out of previously beloved industries, etc., and so on. I would love to see any government intervention from either side of the aisle. I'll vote for anybody, for example, who would make it illegal for hedge funds to own private residences. I mean, let's start there. And we can work outwards from there to bring economic asset ownership, to redistribute economic asset ownership, even just a fraction wider than it currently is, and to bring more ownership back into named human hands rather than impersonal corporate hands. I think that would be a great start. And the other may well be the other policy which I would like to see, which I suspect might be more controversial in these quarters, would be to radically slow or even halt international immigration. This is not a popular thing to talk about certainly on the left, but it's fundamentally a neoliberal policy which attacks the ability of working people to command a living wage. It's profoundly unpopular across huge swathes of the country, and it's radicalizing young graduates in the United Kingdom at the moment in a way which I think could prove extremely dangerous to social cohesion overall, unless it's addressed, and it's addressed frankly and very directly very soon. So those would be my 2, you know, halt financialization and slow or even stop mass immigration.
Very interesting. Thanks, Mary. Paul?
In the last 2 chapters of our book, Reclaiming Populism, we lay out an architecture for trying to achieve high levels of social mobility. It's very difficult, and it's not easy, and it's complicated. But if I was to pick one thing right now, if I was running for office, I would advocate for a basic income. I think we have enough evidence from the myriad of pilot projects around the world that a properly delivered basic income guarantee, what I call BIG, would have an immediate impact on micro decisions that people have to make in their everyday lives, mundane decisions that we take for granted. A new pair of shoes, going to the dentist, a pair of eyeglasses, that not only impacts people's individual lives in the way that the state can anticipate, because as you bring the money closer to the choice, it's people who understand how these small fiscal transfers will change their life. But what we know from all the data is it has a very powerful impact on economic, health, and social outcomes. You lift all the boats when you provide regular, guaranteed income transfers to citizens. I think in one fell swoop, you could actually head off a lot of the populist complaint, notwithstanding the fact that social mobility is a moving target, and we have a lot of work to do. But I think a basic income guarantee would be the fundamental way that social democracies can change the direction that we're going in.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And thanks to Mary, who just had to leave a little bit early. Gerry, over to you.
Oh, it's a massive question. I think we need to question business as usual, which our official opposition is just failing miserably to do. We need to understand the cost of not investing. To do that, we just need to do a quick Google at the state of European countries compared to ours. You could pick any indicator you care to think of and see where we're going wrong. So understand the cost of not investing. I think we need to expect much more from the private sector. I think we need to expect much more from our state. Think of it as a positive driver in for future change. Get serious about net zero, and that's where we need to rethink the role of the state. And also that ties into the basic income point Paul just made, how people can become productive in a new way through investing in net zero, and allied to that, take back control of energy and transport, and finally get much better at tax. Our tax system is broken in the UK. And tax the wealthy, of course. And PR, which is probably the most important thing. Make votes matter.
That's getting to a long list. Excellent. Thanks, Gerry. And Peter, finally to you.
Well, the problem that we the predicament we find ourselves in has developed over many decades. It will take actually many years and probably decades to solve it. So to me, I would like to go back to the question that Mary actually raised, that the lack of power. So to me, one of the most important things that we need to do to shut the wealth pump is to give return power back to workers. All right, so allow them to organize, and also part of the reason that they are losing power is because of the labor oversupply, which is made worse by massive immigration. So she is quite correct that this is something that needs to be controlled much better. And just to say that, resorting to the question of equality versus fairness, I'm not advocating completely egalitarian societies. My point is that back in the between 1960s and 1970s, apart from the racial issues, right, the United States was actually a Nordic country. And there was big differences between CEOs and workers, right? So there were maybe 25-fold difference, but it's not 500-fold like now. So the question of fairness is also very close to what I'm talking about. We need to get back the wages to increase together with worker productivity. That's the basic issue of fairness, all right? And that's where what we need to be working. And when we do that, we'll shut down the wealth pump, and that will reduce the social pressures for instability, although not immediately.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. And that's a great note on which to end. Thank you to Peter, Mary, Gerry, and Paul. Thank you all for coming and for your questions. The next event in our series is on the evening of the 24th of January at Bush House in central London, with Liam Byrne MP talking about his new book, The Inequality of Wealth, Why It Matters and How to Fix It. Unfortunately, in-person tickets have been snapped up, but the live stream tickets are still available via our website. Thank you and goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks.
Thank you.